There's a difference between a mystery and a secret. Mysteries provoke curiosity. Secrets exist because someone didn't want us to know about them. And once they surface, they make urban legends look harmless. From weapons that can make you hear voices to animal mind control and bioweapon leaks, we've even learned that our personal data got used to weaponize political campaigns. Don't watch this video if you're still under the impression that the powers that be can be trusted. But before we drag all this into the daylight, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap that bell. It really helps us out and tells YouTube you'd rather get the facts than the fluff. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 of the best kept secrets that'll scare you. 25. Voice-to-skull weapons. Have you ever heard of the microwave auditory effect? Just think short microwave pulses that can make you hear clicks or tones inside your head, and you'll have the idea. Our army took one look at that and funded research to see how far they could push it. We know of at least two projects that came about over the years. One was V2K, short for Voice to Skull. Another one was called Medusa, which stood for Mob Excess Deterrent Using Silent Audio. Both tried to see if you could create a sound inside someone's skull, or even send secret messages that way. The work was reported in bits and pieces over the years, and some of the files and online references have appeared and disappeared since then. There have even been claims that early tests were done on detainees instead of volunteers, but the government has never confirmed nor denied any of it. 24. America's involvement in Iraq's 1980s chemical weapons campaign. During the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein's forces used mustard gas and nerve agents on Iranian troops and even on Iraqi citizens. That part is well documented. What took a lot longer to come out was how much the US knew while it was happening. Declassified CIA files have shown that American officials were regularly updated on Iraq's attacks, including where chemical agents were being used and how often. Despite that, the US kept giving Iraq battlefield intelligence like satellite images, maps, and details about Iranian troop movements. All of that helped Iraq to plan their offenses, including the ones that used chemical weapons. 23. The Soviet Union's automatic Doomsday system. The Soviets have a Doomsday machine called Perimeter, although insiders call it Dead Hand. It was built for one scenario. If a nuclear attack wiped out the leadership and cut all communication, the system would take over and fire back automatically. Perimeter constantly watches a network of sensors for signs of a strike. That includes pressure changes, radiation spikes, and seismic activity. If something gets detected and the command chain stays silent, control shifts to a small crew sealed inside a protected bunker. They're the ones who can fire special command missiles that send radio orders to any surviving Soviet weapons. The idea behind the whole thing was to stop nervous generals from launching early during tense moments. And according to multiple reports and former officials, part of the system remains active to this day. 22. The CIA's heart attack gun. During the Cold War, the CIA created an assassination weapon that ended up being known as the heart attack gun. It looked like a regular M1911 pistol, but instead of bullets, it fired a frozen pellet of saxitoxin, a poison taken from shellfish. The pellet was tiny, about the width of a human hair, and left only a small red pinprick when it hit the body. Once inside, it melted and caused paralytic shellfish poisoning. Breathing shut down first, then the heart, and unless someone knew exactly what to look for, the death looked like a heart attack. The toxin came from a CIA program called MK Naomi, which was supposed to destroy its supplies after Nixon banned biological weapons, but of course, some of it ended up in storage. As for the gun itself, the CIA never confirmed whether it was ever used in the field. 21. Remote-controlled dogs. Project MKUltra is usually remembered for the drugs and interrogation experiments, but newly released files show that the CIA actually created remote-controlled dogs. Electrodes were surgically implanted deep inside the dogs' brains, and a stimulator on the harness delivered electrical rewards that made the animals move on command. According to one declassified letter, the team spent years testing the setup on rats, and eventually on several breeds of dogs. By the mid-60s, they had at least 6 dogs that could run, turn, stop, and follow patterns in an open field. It was all controlled wirelessly from as far as a couple hundred yards away. 20. The U.S. Atrocities in Vietnam. In the early 70s, the Pentagon assembled a massive archive on war crimes in Vietnam. It wasn't public and didn't see daylight for decades. When the files were finally declassified, they showed that Army investigators confirmed more than 300 separate atrocities across every division that served in Vietnam. The files detailed repeated cases of severe misconduct against villagers who weren't a part of the fight, things that I cannot mention here on YouTube. Investigators determined that at least 203 soldiers should have faced charges. Only 57 were ever court-martialed, and fewer than 24 were convicted. Several were able to walk away with reduced sentences, reprimands, or got away without facing any consequences at all. 19. Project 1794. Declassified Air Force archives have provided us with evidence that the U.S. military really did try to build a supersonic flying saucer. On paper, it was supposed to reach 100,000 feet and fly at Mach 4, which would have made it faster than anything in the sky at the time. It gets scary when you learn the 1956 report for the project, published in 2012, stated that the saucer would, quote, wage psychological warfare on the Soviets. Its site would sow panic and deliver bombs or even nuclear weapons. Engineers actually built and tested a prototype hovercraft called the Avrocar, but it never came close to the ambitious goals and was ultimately scrapped as impractical. For years, the very idea that the Air Force tried to design a flying saucer was ridiculed as a conspiracy theory. Now we know that they spent millions on it in secret. 18. Able Archer. Most of NATO's yearly crisis drills came and went without anyone blinking, except for the one in 1983. That year's exercise, Able Archer, looked a little too real from the outside. NATO practiced everything from moving warheads to shifting alert levels, and the whole thing ended up looking like a genuine countdown instead of a training scenario. On the Soviet side, leaders were already on edge. Their intelligence program was designed to flag even the smallest hint of a surprise attack, and Able Archer matched every warning sign they were taught to look for. Reports released later showed that Soviet commanders quietly raised their readiness levels and even positioned nuclear units to act if they thought things were going to go bad. One wrong read from either side could have changed the world overnight. It's still believed to be one of the closest calls of the entire Cold War. 17. A private company sold spyware to the world's worst governments. In 2021, a massive data leak exposed how a private Israeli company called NSO Group had been selling military-grade phone hacking software to governments around the world. The tool is called Pegasus, and once it gets into your phone, whoever controls it can see your messages, hear your calls, read your emails, turn on your microphone, track your location, and basically follow your entire life without you ever knowing. The leak included around 50,000 phone numbers flagged as potential targets, from heads of state to reporters, activists, and even the family of Jamal Khashoggi. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, well, he was a well-known writer who spent years covering Middle Eastern politics and openly criticizing the Saudi government. In 2018, he walked into their consulate in Istanbul for paperwork and never came out. Investigators later confirmed he was killed inside the building, which set off a global outcry. The investigation ultimately linked Pegasus to at least 11 governments. More than 180 reporters across 20 countries showed up on the list. 16. The Deceit in East Germany. When East Germany collapsed in 1989, the Stasi panicked. They tore their files apart by hand, stuffed the pieces into sacks, and hoped no one would ever be able to put the story back together. The problem was that they left behind 15,000 bags of ripped up pages. And inside those scraps were decades of surveillance notes, informant reports, and records on ordinary citizens. Germany later built a full archive to restore those documents, and archivists have spent years sorting the fragments by color, paper texture, and handwriting just to rebuild the truth. In the end, though, the part that hit the hardest wasn't the surveillance technology nor the secret reports, but the informants. The Stasi recruited neighbors, co-workers, and in a shocking number of cases, people's own family members. One dissident woman opened a reconstructed file and found out her husband had been reporting on her for years. In another case, a mother was awarded the state medal for informing on her son. By the 80s, estimates say there was roughly one informer for every 6 or 7 citizens. 15. The NSA's surveillance catalog. After Edward Snowden leaked that mountain of classified files in 2013, the big shock wasn't just surveillance programs, but also a 50-page NSA document called the Ant Catalog. It basically showed a secret menu of hardware the agency would use to slip into almost any device on the market. Some of them were tiny implants the NSA could add to a computer before it even reached the buyer. Others looked like ordinary cables or USB plugs, but sent data out over hidden radio links. One of the most infamous was Cottonmouth, a device disguised as a regular USB connector that opened a wireless backdoor into computers that weren't even connected to the internet. Snowden later debated the issue publicly and argued that if you build a master key for the government, someone else will eventually find it. The catalog confirmed that the US government had already built and stockpiled hardware designed to bypass encryption, jump air gaps, and tap routers, servers, and personal computers without leaving anything behind. 14. Overthrowing democracy in Iran. In 2013, the CIA finally declassified records that settled a long-running argument about the 1953 coup in Iran. The files confirmed that the agency, working with British intelligence, helped push Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh out of power and put General Fazlollah Zahedi in his place. The level of detail surprised a lot of people. The documents showed how foreign operatives backed street protests, funded opposition networks, and coordinated with the Shah while he briefly fled the country. Some of the released material even included maps marking out where hired groups were supposed to create tension to turn public opinion. 13. Testing bioweapons on unsuspecting cities. During the 50s and 60s, the US military ran a series of secret tests to figure out how vulnerable the country was to biological attacks. More than 200 of these trials took place on American soil, and some of them were basically unbelievable. In 1949, Army operatives walked into the Pentagon, slipped into the building's ventilation system, and sprayed a cloud of bacteria that later spread through the offices. A year later, they released microbes off the coasts of Norfolk and San Francisco. Monitors later found signs of exposure across nearly the entire population of San Francisco. By the mid-50s, the program expanded into full city tests. Teams released more bacteria in St. Louis, Minneapolis, and even Winnipeg, while local officials were told they were studying smoke patterns. Other trials used airplanes to see how far these particles could travel. One test eventually spread across an area that stretched from South Dakota to Minnesota and drifted more than 1,000 miles. 12. The gasoline conspiracy. Leaded gas sits right up there with cigarettes as one of the biggest public health disasters we actually engineered ourselves. In the 20s, oil companies began adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline because it stopped engines from knocking. The problem was that lead is a neurotoxin, and everyone involved already knew it. Internal memos show that scientists were warning companies like General Motors and Standard Oil that workers were getting sick, having tremors, and in severe cases, dying. Instead of pulling the product, executives decided to launch a PR campaign and insisted it was safe. A government study later confirmed how dangerous the fumes were, but the results were kept quiet while the industry kept marketing leaded fuel as a modern miracle. By the time the US finally phased it out in the 70s, millions of children had absorbed lead through air pollution alone. And even then, the companies kept selling leaded gasoline in other countries for more than a decade. 11. Nazi scientists built America's rockets. The final months of World War II triggered a race between the US and the Soviet Union to grab as many German scientists as possible. The Americans called their effort Operation Paperclip. On paper, President Truman said nobody with active Nazi involvement could be brought in, though things played out very differently. Investigators later found that officials at the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency simply rewrote biographies, removed documents, and hid wartime activities so that certain scientists could get in. A number of these men had worked in programs linked to forced labor or other abuses. When the truth finally came to light decades later, several Operation Paperclip recruits came under scrutiny. Some, like Arthur Rudolph and Walter Schreiber, were pushed out of the US. Others, like Werner von Braun, remained in the country but became the focus of later investigations. None of them were prosecuted, but the cover-up is now a documented chapter of the program. 10. The CIA bankrolled the Dalai Lama for years. Most people picture the current Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, as the calm, peaceful spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, which he is, but he was also tangled up in one of the CIA's other operations. Declassified files released in the late 90s showed that through the 60s and into the early 70s, the CIA funneled millions into Tibetan resistance groups fighting Chinese control. The program trained guerrilla fighters, funded operations, and even sent support money to the Dalai Lama's office while he lived in exile. Washington's goal wasn't exactly mysterious. The idea was to weaken communist China by keeping Tibetan resistance alive and organized, especially from bases in India and Nepal. Be that as it may, the Dalai Lama later wrote that the funding had far more to do with Cold War strategy than any real push for Tibetan independence. He's still the recognized spiritual leader today. 9. Digital sabotage. Stuxnet showed up in 2010 inside Iran's Natanz nuclear facility and tore through their centrifuges with almost surgical precision. Computer viruses don't usually know how to sabotage uranium enrichment equipment, so everyone knew this wasn't the work of some teenager in a basement. Declassified details and reporting later confirmed what most people basically already suspected. Stuxnet was a joint US-Israeli operation developed under a covert program that ran through the Bush years and continued under President Obama. The goal was simple: slow down Iran's nuclear progress without sending in bombers or kicking off a new war. The malware was designed to make the centrifuges spin themselves to death while feeding operators fake data so they wouldn't notice the damage in time. By the time Iran figured out what had hit them, reports say the worm had destroyed roughly 1,000 machines. 8. A nuclear disaster was hidden from the world for 30 years. In September 1957, a storage tank full of nuclear waste overheated and exploded at the Mayak plutonium complex in the Soviet Union. The explosion sent radioactive material across 20,000 square miles of the southern Urals, making it the worst nuclear accident prior to Chernobyl. Instead of warning anyone, the Soviets buried it. Villages were cleared out in secrecy, residents were relocated without explanation, and several contaminated settlements were literally wiped off the maps. The Soviets even used the nearby city of Kishtim as a decoy name to conceal the real location of the Mayak facility. Later estimates suggest that 200 or more people died from acute radiation and around 270,000 were exposed to dangerous fallout. The world only learned about it in 1976 when Soviet biologist Zhorej Medvedev, who had been barred from returning home, published the details and exposed the disaster. 7. We almost nuked North Carolina. In January 1961, a B-52 bomber broke apart in midair over North Carolina while carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. When the plane fell into a tailspin, both nuclear weapons dropped. One slammed into a field and failed on impact. The other floated down by parachute and went through nearly every step of a real nuclear detonation. Its switches armed, its trigger sequence activated, and only a single low-voltage safety switch kept it from detonating. Each bomb carried a 4-megaton payload, which is roughly 260 times the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Engineers later calculated that if it had gone off, radioactive fallout would have spread across the East Coast, probably reaching Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and parts of New York. 6. Media manipulation. Do you still believe the news you hear on TV or read on the internet? Well, maybe you shouldn't. By the 60s, the CIA was already launching secret campaigns, in this case Operation Mockingbird, to influence and control the press. Under this effort, which eventually got exposed by Congress in the 1975 Church Committee hearings, the CIA recruited dozens of American and foreign journalists as agents or assets. These reporters and editors, working for major news outlets, would write their stories in such a way that it was favorable to CIA objectives or publish propaganda under the guise of independent journalism. The agency also funded student and cultural organizations and even had ties to publishing houses. Though the full extent is still debated, it is a known fact that the CIA covertly paid or persuaded media personnel to report their narratives. 5. An anthrax leak. The deadliest anthrax outbreak on record happened inside the Soviet Union and stayed hidden for more than a decade. In the spring of 1979, people around Sverdlovsk started showing up in hospitals with symptoms that doctors struggled to explain. Officials blamed contaminated meat, but the pattern of deaths told a different story. The cases lined up almost perfectly with a straight path leading away from a restricted military compound. That area housed a Soviet facility that produced anthrax for the country's biological weapons program. A filter had reportedly been removed for maintenance, spores leaked into the air, and the wind carried them straight across a busy neighborhood. 4. Black sites and torture programs. After 9/11, the CIA set up a network of off-the-books prisons around the world. A lot of countries helped out, and people caught in counter-terror operations were flown around, held without lawyers, and questioned under the kind of conditions the Senate later said broke U.S. and international law. I cannot spell out the methods here unless we want YouTube to pull the plug on this video, but the 2014 Senate report made it clear they crossed lines no democracy should ever cross. About 119 men passed through these black sites, and thousands more ended up in places like Abu Ghraib, Bagram, and Guantanamo, a lot of them without ever being charged. 3. The military's reach into the sports industry. The pre-game routine at major sports events has been around forever. The anthem, the oversized flag, the jets overhead, but a lot of that pageantry didn't appear by accident. From the mid-2000s into the 2010s, the Department of Defense and the National Guard paid pro sports leagues millions of dollars to stage patriotic moments on camera. The idea was simple: make the service look admirable and visible, and hopefully boost recruitment. A 2015 Senate report showed that the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL, and even college programs took part. What makes it even more surprising is that before 2009, NFL players didn't even stand on the field for the anthem. That only became a tradition after the money started flowing. 2. The Asbestos Cover-Up. The dangers of asbestos were documented as early as the 30s, when company doctors warned manufacturers that the fibers caused severe lung disease and cancer. Instead of pulling asbestos from the market, major firms hid the data, silenced critics, and even instructed their own medical staff not to tell workers when their lungs showed signs of damage. By the 60s, the evidence was overwhelming, but executives kept filing upbeat reports while miners, factory workers, mechanics, and firefighters kept breathing in the dust. Lawsuits eventually exposed internal memos showing decades of cover-ups, and by the 90s, more than 24 companies had collapsed under liability claims. But, and you're probably not going to believe this, The US only banned the last remaining form of asbestos, chrysotile, in 2024, while Europe had been done with it for ages. 1. Election manipulation. In 2018, whistleblower Christopher Wiley revealed that a political consulting firm, Cambridge Analytica, had secretly harvested personal data from over 50 million Facebook users, without their consent, to build psychographic profiles and weaponize them for political campaigns. The firm used Facebook quizzes and apps that scooped up your likes, your interests, and even information on your friends, then used it to push tailored political messaging. Wiley later described it as a psychological warfare tool, which tells you exactly how the company saw it. What made it worse is that Facebook learned about the breach in 2015 and didn't say a word about it for years. By the time reporters finally exposed it, the damage was done. It showed how fast your personal information can be pulled into political games without you even realizing it. And it's a big part of why people now compare data to oil. There's real money and power in it, and a lot of people are willing to use it for their own purposes. And that's where I'm calling it before we end up on a watch list together. But if you want to keep going, I've got a related video for you that is packed with the kinds of stuff most governments would prefer that, we didn't talk about. You'll hear about South Korea's secret TV channel for North Koreans, the time Kodak accidentally figured out our nuclear history, a covert Navy SEAL unit, and, it's all in there. That link will pop up here in just a few seconds. As always, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. You truly are the best. Again, like, share, comment, subscribe, notification bell, and I'll see you soon.